Broken man falls for Uber driver who knows his deepest secrets before he tells her. Diane's hands trembled on the steering wheel as her regular passenger climbed in, clutching the same worn paperback that had saved his life. "Tonight's the night I finally give up," Jude whispered, his voice cracking. "Even D.J. Johnson's words can't fix me anymore." She watched him in the rearview mirror, holding the book she'd written 3 years ago during her own darkest hour. Should she tell him? Could she save him the way her own words once saved her? The familiar weight of his despair settled into her back seat like fog rolling in from the harbor. For 6 months, Jude Carpenter had been climbing into her car at exactly 11:47 every Tuesday through Saturday night, same corner of Pine and 3rd, same destination 12 blocks away. Same broken voice, filling the space between them with confessions that should have belonged to a therapist's office, not the vinyl interior of a Honda Civic with 200,000 miles on it. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the book in his weathered hands shook like autumn leaves about to fall. Diane pulled the car over, hazard lights painting the empty street in amber pulses. She couldn't drive while he talked about giving up, not when she knew exactly which passages he'd underlined, which chapters he'd dog-eared during his worst nights, not when every word of hope he'd found came from her own soul, written during those sleepless months after her world had crumbled. "I can't do this anymore," she heard herself say, turning in the driver's seat to face him fully for the first time in all these months. His eyes met hers through the darkness, and something electric passed between them. Blue eyes rimmed with exhaustion, stubbled jaw tight with the effort of holding himself together, work shirt bearing the logo of the warehouse that paid him barely enough to survive. This was the man whose pain had unknowingly inspired her most successful novel about healing from heartbreak, whose midnight confessions had become the raw material for stories that had touched millions of readers. "You have kind eyes," he said softly, his voice catching, "like you understand pain." Diane's fingers moved toward him instinctively, stopping just short of touching his tear-stained cheek. 6 months of professional distance collapsed in that moment. 6 months of biting her tongue when he quoted her own words back to her, of fighting the urge to reach through the partition between driver and passenger and tell him that everything he was feeling had once lived in her chest too. "Tell me about the book," she whispered. Jude's laugh came out broken. "You don't want to hear about my obsession with some romance writer who probably lives in a mansion and has never known real struggle. If only he knew that D.J. Johnson drove a 10-year-old Honda and lived on coffee and determination, that the mansion belonged to her public persona while the real woman sat 3 feet away from him, wearing a baseball cap and yesterday's jeans. "Try me," she said. He opened the book with the reverence of someone handling scripture. Pages fell open to passages highlighted in 3 different colors, margins filled with handwritten notes in careful block letters. "This part," he said, voice steadying as he read aloud, "about finding worth in ashes, about how sometimes you have to burn everything down before you can see what's really valuable." Those words. She remembered writing them at 3 a.m, tears blurring her laptop screen as she poured her own devastation onto the page, after Marcus had left, after her first publishing contract had fallen through, after she thought her dreams were as dead as everything else in her life. "She saved me," Jude continued, tracing the words with his finger. "When my business failed, when Michelle walked out calling me a dreamer who never delivers, when I had nothing left but this warehouse job that barely pays rent. These books became my lifeline. This woman I'll never meet became the voice telling me I wasn't worthless." Diane's throat tightened. "Tell me about Michelle." "My ex-wife said I was too soft, too emotional, that real men don't cry over books or believe in second chances." His voice hardened. "Maybe she was right. Maybe I'm just a dreamer who never delivers." "Or maybe," Diane said carefully, "she couldn't see your strength because she mistook gentleness for weakness." Jude's eyes searched her face in the dim light. How do you know exactly what to say? It's like you can see straight into my soul. Because I can, she wanted to tell him. Because every word you've spoken in this car has already lived in my heart. Because I wrote your healing before I knew your name. Instead, she reached toward him, her fingers brushing his knuckles where they gripped the book. The contact sent electricity up her arm, a recognition so deep, it felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. I'm sorry, he whispered, pulling back slightly. I keep dumping my problems on you. You probably have your own struggles, and here I am treating you like my personal therapist. Don't apologize, she said, her hand still tingling from the brief contact. Everyone needs someone to see them. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally broke, drumming against the windshield in a rhythm that matched her racing heart. She should start the car, drive him home like always, maintain the professional distance that had kept them both safe in their separate kinds of loneliness. Instead, she heard herself saying, You shouldn't be alone tonight. Jude stared at her. What? There's a diner on 6th Street, open all night, sometimes when the darkness feels too heavy. Sitting in fluorescent lights with strangers around helps. She paused, knowing she was crossing a line she'd drawn 6 months ago. Want to get some coffee? The silence stretched between them, filled, with the sound of rain and possibility. Then Jude nodded, and Diane felt something shift in her chest, like a door she'd kept locked suddenly swinging open. The diner at 2 a.m. felt like a pocket universe, all vinyl booths and coffee steam and the soft clatter of dishes being washed in the back. They slid into a corner booth, and under the harsh lights, Diane could see the full extent of what these months had done to him. Hollow cheeks, hands that shook slightly when he wasn't holding something steady, the particular exhaustion that came from fighting to stay afloat in deep water. You know what the strangest part is, Jude said, cradling his coffee cup like it was anchor. I used to think D.J. Johnson was a man. The writing felt so, I don't know, like someone who understood what it meant to fail as a man, to feel like you couldn't protect the people you loved. Diane's coffee turned bitter on her tongue. What changed your mind? The latest book. The way she wrote about forgiveness, about being gentle with yourself. That's not how men are taught to think. He smiled for the first time she'd ever seen. Whoever she is a heart big enough to hold everyone's pain and somehow transform it into hope. The words hit her like a physical blow. Here was this beautiful, broken man describing her work with more insight than any professional reviewer ever had, and he had no idea he was talking to the woman whose late-night writing sessions had been fueled by conversations just like this one. Jude, she said, then stopped. His name felt foreign and familiar on her lips, the first time she'd spoken it aloud, though she'd known it for months. You know my name. You mentioned it. The night you talked about the divorce papers. He nodded, but his eyes stayed on her face with new curiosity. I don't know yours. Diane, she said, offering him the truth that was also a lie. Diane the driver, not DJ the author, the woman in the baseball cap, not the one whose photograph appeared on book jackets. Diane, he repeated, and something about the way he said it made her name sound like a prayer. Their hands rested on the table between them, and without thinking, Diane reached across the scratched formica and covered his with hers. His skin was warm, calloused from honest work, and when he looked up at her, she saw something she hadn't expected. Recognition. Not of her identity, but of something deeper. The way broken people found each other in the dark. The way healing sometimes wore the disguise of coincidence. You see me? He whispered, his voice barely audible over the diner's late-night sounds. Really see me. How do you do that? Because I am you, she thought. Because your pain taught me how to write about hope, and my words gave you reason to keep breathing, and somehow we've been saving each other without knowing it. Maybe, she said instead, we're both exactly what the other person needed to find. His fingers intertwined with hers, and in that moment, Diane felt the careful walls she'd built around her secret life beginning to crack. The famous author who hid behind initials and pen names, the lonely woman who drove strangers through the night seeking authentic connection, the broken heart that had learned to beat again by writing love letters to the world disguised as novels. All of it was dissolving under the warmth of Jude Carpenter's touch, and the realization that she was falling in love with the man whose midnight confessions had been her salvation long before she became his. Have you ever met someone whose pain perfectly matched the healing you needed to give? Tell me your story in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe if you're already feeling the connection between these two wounded souls. The rain continued outside, but inside the diner, surrounded by the gentle noise of a world that never slept, something new was beginning. Something that felt like destiny wearing the comfortable clothes of coincidence, like hope disguised as an ordinary Tuesday night, like love that had been writing itself long before either of them knew they were characters in each other's stories. 3 weeks passed, and their routine transformed into something neither of them had planned. Jude still called for rides, but now the destinations varied. The art museum when he needed to remember that beauty existed. The waterfront when the warehouse walls felt too close. Sometimes nowhere at all, just driving through the city while they talked about books and dreams and the particular weight of starting over at 34. He brought her coffee now, learning without asking that she took it black with 1 sugar. She remembered details about his days, asking about the interview he'd mentioned, the co-worker who'd been giving him trouble, the small victories that felt enormous when you were building yourself back from nothing. The professional distance that had once felt necessary now seemed impossible to maintain. When Jude climbed into her car, the air itself seemed to change, charged with possibility and the growing awareness that what was happening between them had moved far beyond driver and passenger. But with each passing night, Diane felt the weight of her deception growing heavier. Every time he quoted her books, every time he talked about wanting to meet D.J. Johnson to thank her personally, every time he said the author's words had saved his life, guilt twisted in her chest like a knife. She was living a double life, and both versions of herself were falling in love with the same man. "I've been thinking," Jude said one night as they sat parked outside his apartment building, neither of them ready to end their conversation, "about what comes next." Next? After rock bottom. D.J. Johnson's latest book talks about it in the final chapter, about how sometimes you have to stop surviving and start living. He turned to face her in the passenger seat, and in the glow of the streetlight, his eyes held something new: determination. "I think I'm ready to try living again." Diane's heart clenched. "What would that look like?" "Getting my contractor's license back. Starting small, maybe just handyman work at first, but building toward something real again." He paused. "And maybe being brave enough to tell someone how I feel about them." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Diane felt her carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. "Jude, I know this is complicated," he said quickly. "I know you're my driver, and there are probably rules about this kind of thing. But these past few weeks, talking to you, being with you, I feel like myself again, like the man I was before everything fell apart." Before she could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. As he glanced at it, his expression changed. "What is it?" "Michelle, my ex-wife." His voice went flat. "She wants me to clear out the storage unit. Says she's tired of paying for my junk." Diane watched the light fade from his eyes, watched him retreat back into the shell of the broken man she'd first met 6 months ago. All his talk of living again, of being brave, crumbling under the weight of facing his past failures. When? She asked. This weekend. I've been putting it off for months. I can't face going through all of that alone. The business plans that never worked out, the tools I can't afford to keep, the wedding pictures. He trailed off, then laughed bitterly. Listen to me. 34 years old and terrified of a storage unit. You don't have to do it alone, Diane heard herself saying. Jude looked at her in surprise. Diane, you don't understand. It's going to be ugly. Me breaking down over cardboard boxes full of failures. You don't want to see that. Yes, she said firmly, I do. Because she did want to see it, all of it, the ugly parts and the broken pieces, and the man he'd been before life had worn him down to nothing. She wanted to witness his healing, not just as the author whose words had guided him through darkness, but as the woman who was falling in love with both his strength and his vulnerability. Are you sure? He asked softly. I'm sure. As he climbed out of the car, Jude hesitated with his hand on the door. Diane, thank you for seeing me, for all of this. After he disappeared into the building, Diane sat in her car and tried to reconcile the two worlds that were about to collide. The famous author who'd written about healing from heartbreak, and the woman who was about to help the man she loved face his own broken past. She had no idea that going through Jude's belongings would mean discovering just how deeply her words had penetrated his soul, or that seeing her books through his eyes would change everything she thought she knew about love, destiny, and the courage it took to be completely seen. Chapter 2. Saturday morning dawned gray and drizzling, the kind of Seattle weather that matched the solemnity of the task ahead. Diane picked up Jude at 8, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands fidgeted with the storage unit key, like a talisman he wasn't sure he wanted to use. Last chance to change your mind about this, he said as they pulled into the storage facility parking lot. Fair warning, I might cry. I might punch something. I might have a complete breakdown. Good thing I brought tissues, Diane replied, patting the box on the dashboard. Unit 247 was painted institutional beige and secured with a lock that stuck. As Jude wrestled with the key, muttering under his breath, Diane felt her phone buzz with a text from her editor. Manuscript still missing. Need update ASAP. She silenced the phone. Whatever crisis existed in D.J. Johnson's professional life could wait. Right now, the only thing that mattered was the man beside her whose hands were shaking as he finally got the lock open. The metal door rolled up with a screech, revealing a space-packed floor-to-ceiling with the remnants of a life interrupted. Plastic bins labeled in careful handwriting, Business Files 2019 to 2021, wedding photos, kitchen, good china, boxes of tools wrapped in protective plastic, a desk chair that had seen better days, the archaeology of dreams deferred. Jesus, Jude breathed, running a hand through his hair. I forgot how much stuff we accumulated. But Diane wasn't looking at the furniture or the carefully labeled boxes. Her attention was caught by something else entirely. A bookshelf wedged against the back wall, its shelves lined with familiar spines. Every single novel D.J. Johnson had ever published, not just one copy of each, but multiple editions. Hardcover, paperback, international versions, some so well worn the titles had faded, others with pristine dust jackets protected by clear plastic covers, a complete collection that spoke of devotion bordering on obsession. Jude, she said carefully, that's quite a library. He followed her gaze and actually blushed. Yeah, that's probably weird, right? Owning multiple copies of the same books. Diane moved closer, her heart hammering as she took in the sight of her life's work displayed with museum-quality care. Not weird. Dedicated. The hardcovers are first editions, he said, his voice taking on the tone of a collector explaining a prized possession. Took me 2 years to track them all down. The paperbacks are my reading copies, the ones I actually use. And these. He pulled out a set of books that looked like they'd been through a war. These are my survival copies, the ones that lived in my truck, my jacket pocket next to my bed during the worst nights. Diane reached for one of the battered paperbacks, her breath catching as it fell open to reveal pages covered in handwritten notes. Not just highlighting, but actual conversations with the text, questions in the margins, agreements and arguments, and moments where he'd clearly been moved to tears, the ink slightly smeared. "Why does she understand this so perfectly?" She read aloud from one margin note. "How does she know what it feels like to lose everything?" "I know it's crazy," Jude said, gently taking the book from her hands, "talking to someone who can't talk back. But when I was reading these, especially during the divorce, it felt like having a conversation with someone who actually understood." Diane's throat tightened as she watched him handle the book with reverence. This was what her words had meant to someone. Not critical acclaim or sales figures, but actual human connection. Actual healing. "This passage," he continued, flipping to a page marked with multiple bookmarks, "about how sometimes love means letting go of who you thought you were supposed to be. I must have read it 100 times the night Michelle left." He read aloud, his voice soft with memory. "The hardest part isn't losing someone you love. It's losing the version of yourself that existed in relationship to them. When they leave, you're not just mourning their absence, you're mourning the death of who you were when you were loved by them." Diane's knees went weak. She remembered writing those words, remembered the specific heartbreak that had inspired them. To hear them reflected back through Jude's experience, to see how they'd helped him make sense of his own pain. "Are you okay?" Jude asked, noticing her expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's just powerful writing," she managed. "She is. DJ Johnson gets it, you know. The way grief can make you feel like you're drowning in shallow water. The way starting over feels impossible until suddenly it doesn't." He set the book down carefully, then looked at Diane with something approaching embarrassment. "I have this fantasy sometimes, about meeting her, about being able to thank her in person for saving my life." The irony was so sharp it was physically painful. "What would you say to her?" "That her words taught me the difference between surviving and living. That she helped me understand that broken doesn't mean worthless." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That reading her books was the first time in months I felt less alone." Diane turned away, overwhelmed by the weight of his gratitude and her own deception. How could she tell him that every word he'd found healing had been born from pain just like his? That the woman he credited with saving his life was standing 3 feet away, falling in love with the man whose midnight confessions had unknowingly inspired her most honest writing. "Diane." His voice was closer now, concerned. "What's wrong?" She felt his hand on her shoulder, gentle and warm, and something inside her cracked open. 6 months of careful distance, of professional boundaries, of hiding behind her secret identity, all of it dissolved under the simple comfort of his touch. "You think she's so wise," Diane said, her voice breaking. "But what if she's just as lost as everyone else? What if all those answers she writes about are just questions she's still trying to figure out herself?" Jude turned her to face him, his hands settling on her shoulders with careful tenderness. "Then that would make her human. And maybe that's exactly why her words mean so much. Because they are not coming from someone who has it all figured out. They are coming from someone who's been in the dark and found her way to the light, one word at a time." The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with something that had been building for weeks. Diane could see the exact moment when professional concern shifted into something deeper, more personal, when the careful boundaries they'd maintained began to dissolve. "You're not lost," he said softly, his thumbs brushing across her collarbone. "You found me." And then he was kissing her, soft and tentative at first, then with growing certainty as she melted into his touch. His lips tasted like coffee and possibility, his hands cradling her face like she was something precious and fragile and worth protecting. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Diane felt like her entire world had shifted on its axis. The storage unit around them, filled with the remnants of his old life, suddenly felt like a cocoon where something new was being born. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," Jude admitted, his forehead resting against hers. "Just weeks?" Diane asked, and was rewarded with a smile that transformed his entire face. "Maybe months," he confessed. "Maybe since the first night you really listened to me instead of just waiting for the ride to end." They kissed again, deeper this time, 6 months of careful distance collapsing into desperate need for connection. Diane lost herself in the warmth of his mouth, the strength of his arms around her, the way he held her like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his entire life. When his hands slipped under the hem of her shirt, mapping the curve of her waist with reverent fingers, she almost told him everything, almost confessed that she was D.J. Johnson, that every book he treasured had been written by the woman currently coming apart in his arms. But then his phone rang, sharp and insistent in the intimate silence they had created. "Ignore it," he murmured against her neck. It stopped, then immediately started ringing again. "Might be important," Diane said, though every fiber of her being wanted him to keep kissing the sensitive spot just below her ear that was making it hard to think clearly. Jude sighed and pulled away reluctantly, checking the caller ID. His expression shifted immediately from desire to resignation. "Michelle," he said, showing her the screen, "probably calling to make sure I'm actually doing this." He answered on the 4th ring. "Hey, Michelle. Yes, I'm here now. No, I'm not dragging my feet. Fine, I'll have everything out by tonight." Diane watched his face close off, watched him retreat back into the shell of the man who'd first climbed into her car 6 months ago, believing he was worthless. "She wants to meet me here at 6 to make sure I've cleared everything out," he said after hanging up. "Apparently she doesn't trust me to follow through." "Do you want me to stay?" Diane asked, though part of her hoped he'd say no. The intensity of what had just happened between them, combined with the emotional landmine of facing his ex-wife, felt like more than either of them was ready to handle. "Would you?" "I know it's asking a lot." "Of course." They spent the afternoon sorting through the archaeology of Jude's former life, and with each box they packed, Diane felt herself falling deeper in love with the man he'd been before heartbreak had convinced him he was a failure. Business plans that showed creativity and vision, tools maintained with the care of someone who took pride in craftsmanship, letters from satisfied customers praising work that had exceeded their expectations. "You weren't a failure," she said, holding up a thank you card from a family whose kitchen he'd renovated. "Look at this. Jude transformed our house into a home. His attention to detail and genuine care made all the difference." That was before everything fell apart, he said, but she could see the words meant something to him. As the day wore on, the storage unit emptied and their connection deepened. Every shared memory, every revelation about who he'd been before life had broken him down, made Diane more certain that what was happening between them was real and rare and worth fighting for. It also made her more terrified of what would happen when he discovered her true identity. By 5:30, they'd sorted everything into keep, donate, and trash piles. The D.J. Johnson collection was carefully packed in Jude's car, each book wrapped in protective tissue paper like religious artifacts. "She's early," Jude said, spotting a silver BMW pulling into the parking lot. Michelle Torres had the kind of aggressive beauty that came from expensive maintenance and careful presentation. Even at a storage unit on a Saturday evening, she looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine, her outfit coordinated and her makeup flawless. Diane felt suddenly conscious of her own appearance. Jeans with actual dirt on them, hair escaping from her ponytail, the comfortable invisibility she cultivated as an Uber driver. "Jude?" Michelle said, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I see you actually followed through for once. Michelle, he replied evenly, but Diane could see the tension creeping back into his shoulders. Everything's sorted, just need to load the last few boxes. Michelle's gaze swept over the remaining items, then landed on Diane with obvious calculation. And you are? Diane, she said, extending her hand. I was helping Jude today. Michelle's handshake was brief and dismissive. How nice. New girlfriend? The question hung in the air, loaded with implication. Diane felt Jude tense beside her. Diane's a friend, he said carefully. Of course she is, Michelle replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Well, friend Diane, I hope you know what you're getting into. Jude has a tendency to make grand promises he can't keep. Michelle, Jude warned, his voice low. What? I'm just being honest. Ask him about the business he was going to build, the house he was going to buy me, the future he was going to provide. She turned back to Diane. How long before he disappoints you too? Diane felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. This woman had no idea who she was talking to, no understanding of the man Jude really was or what he'd overcome in the months since their divorce. From what I can see, Diane said calmly, Jude is exactly the kind of man who keeps his promises. Maybe the problem wasn't his ability to deliver. Maybe it was your ability to recognize what actually matters. Michelle's perfectly made-up face went cold. Excuse me. I've spent time with him. I've seen how he treats people, how he works, how he cares about things that can't be measured in dollar signs or status symbols. If you couldn't see that, if you walked away from that, then the failure wasn't his. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the faint music from someone's car radio. Then Michelle laughed, sharp and brittle. Oh, this is Rich, another romantic who thinks love conquers all. Give it 6 months, honey. See how long your faith in him lasts when the bills pile up and the dreams don't materialize. She turned to Jude, her expression softening into something that might have been pity. I almost feel sorry for you, building another house of cards, getting ready to watch it fall down again. After she left, driving away in her perfectly maintained BMW, the silence stretched between them like a held breath. I'm sorry, Jude said finally. You didn't deserve that. Neither did you. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the now empty storage unit. She wasn't always like that. When we first got married, she believed in me, believed in us. But when the business started struggling, when the pandemic hit and everything fell apart, he shrugged. Maybe she was right to leave. No, Diane said firmly. She wasn't. Jude looked at her with something like wonder. How can you be so sure? You barely know me. But I do know you, she wanted to say. I know you through every word you've spoken in my car, every story you've shared, every moment of vulnerability you've trusted me with. I know you through the notes you wrote in the margins of my books, through the way you've fought to rebuild yourself one day at a time. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. I know enough, she said simply. This time, when he kissed her, there was nothing tentative about it. 6 months of careful boundaries dissolved completely as his hands tangled in her hair and her body pressed against his with desperate need. The empty storage unit around them became a cocoon where nothing existed except the heat building between them and the recognition that they'd been moving toward this moment since the first night he'd climbed into her car. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jude rested his forehead against hers. Come home with me, he said, his voice rough with want and something deeper. Please. Diane knew that crossing this line would change everything between them. knew that making love to him while hiding her true identity would complicate an already impossible situation, knew that she was falling in love with a man who worshipped the woman she really was without knowing it. She also knew that she'd never wanted anything more in her entire life. "Yes," she whispered, and as they loaded the last boxes into his car, as they drove through the Seattle evening toward whatever came next, Diane felt the careful architecture of her double life beginning to crumble. The famous author who hid behind pen names, the lonely woman who found connection in the anonymous intimacy of driving strangers through the night, the broken heart that had learned to heal by writing love letters to the world. All of it was dissolving under the weight of what she felt for this beautiful, wounded man who had no idea he was falling in love with his salvation. Chapter 3. Jude's apartment was nothing like Diane had expected. Instead of the bachelor squalor she'd imagined, she found a space that spoke of someone who still believed in the possibility of home. Plants thrived on windowsills despite the Seattle gloom. Books were arranged by author rather than scattered randomly. The kitchen showed evidence of actual cooking, not just takeout containers and regret. "It's not much," he said, suddenly self-conscious as he watched her take in his space. "Most of the good furniture went with Michelle, but it's mine." "It's perfect," Diane said, and meant it. This was the home of a man who hadn't given up on himself, not entirely. A man who still watered plants and organized books and made sure there were fresh sheets on the bed even when no one else would see them. The bed. The thought sent heat rushing through her as she watched Jude move around the space, switching on lamps that cast warm pools of light against the evening darkness. They'd crossed so many lines today already, professional boundaries, emotional walls, the careful distance that had kept them both safe. What was one more? "Wine?" he offered, holding up a bottle that looked like it had been waiting for a special occasion. "I know it's not much, but—" "Jude." She stepped closer, close enough to see the pulse jumping in his throat, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin. "Stop. Apologizing for everything? You don't need to earn my presence here." He set the wine down carefully, his hands trembling slightly. It's been a long time since someone saw my life and didn't find it lacking." Diane's heart broke a little at the vulnerability in his voice. How many times had Michelle made him feel like his best wasn't good enough? How many years had he spent believing that love was something he had to earn rather than something he deserved, simply by being who he was? "Your life isn't lacking," she said, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "It's real. It's honest. It's beautiful." When he kissed her this time, it was with the desperation of a man who'd been drowning and suddenly found air. His hands cupped her face with reverent care, his lips moving against hers with growing confidence as she melted into his touch. "I've been thinking about this all day," he confessed against her mouth. "Since the storage unit. Since you defended me to Michelle. Since I realized what it felt like to have someone truly see me." "I see you," Diane whispered, and meant it more than he could ever know. She saw the man whose midnight confessions had inspired her writing, whose pain had taught her about resilience, whose journey toward healing had been the secret soundtrack to her most honest work. They moved together toward the couch, a tangle of gentle hands and searching mouths. When Jude pulled back to look at her, his eyes were dark with want and something deeper. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, "because once we cross this line—" "I'm sure," Diane said, though part of her wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. How could she give herself to him completely while hiding such a fundamental part of who she was? But then his hands were tangling in her hair, and his mouth was tracing the curve of her neck, and all rational thought dissolved under the overwhelming need to be closer to him, to heal the parts of both of them that had been broken for too long. They made love on his couch with the reverence of people who'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly wanted. Jude touched her like she was precious and fragile and strong all at once, his hands mapping every curve with careful attention. When he whispered her name against her skin, it sounded like a prayer of gratitude. Afterward, they lay wrapped in the throw blanket from his couch, watching shadows play across the ceiling as the city settled into full darkness outside his windows. "Diane," Jude said softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing something in me worth saving." The words hit her like a physical blow. If only he knew that he'd been saving her long before she'd known his name, that every story she'd written about healing and hope had been inspired by conversations exactly like the ones they'd shared, that the woman he was thanking for seeing his worth was the same woman who'd poured his pain into best-selling novels that had touched millions of readers. "You saved yourself," she said instead, pressing a kiss to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I just reminded you of what was already there." Days turned into weeks, and what had started as professional boundaries completely dissolved into something neither of them had expected. Jude still called for rides, but now they were adventures disguised as transportation. The farmer's market on Saturday mornings, the bookstore where he bought her coffee while she browsed the shelves, fighting the surreal experience of seeing her own books displayed while he talked about the author who'd changed his life. Their physical connection deepened with each encounter, stolen kisses between destinations, hands that lingered during casual contact, the growing awareness that they were both falling into something that felt like forever. But with each passing day, Diane felt the weight of her deception growing heavier. The manuscript deadline her editor kept pushing, the book tour that was scheduled for next month, the careful architecture of D.J. Johnson's career that required her continued anonymity. And worse, the growing realization that Jude was falling in love with two different versions of the same woman without knowing it. The crisis came on a Thursday evening in late November. Diane had just picked up Jude from his warehouse job when her phone exploded with notifications. Her editor, her publicist, her agent, all demanding to know where she was and why she wasn't responding to urgent messages about the upcoming book release. "Everything okay?" Jude asked, noticing her distraction as she tried to read texts while driving. "Just work stuff," she said, which was both true and completely inadequate. "I didn't know Uber drivers had this much corporate drama." Diane's stomach clenched. The lies were getting harder to maintain, especially when Jude was looking at her with such trust and affection. "Where do you want to go tonight?" she asked, changing the subject. "Actually, I have some news." "Good news, I think." His voice held excitement she hadn't heard since they'd met. "I got a call today. About the contracting license. There's a company that's willing to sponsor me, help me get back on my feet. Small jobs at first, but it's a real chance to rebuild." "Jude, that's amazing. There's just one thing. They want to meet with me tomorrow afternoon. Kind of an interview/presentation thing, and I'm terrified." Diane felt something cold settle in her stomach. Tomorrow afternoon was when she was supposed to meet with her publisher about the final manuscript revisions, the meeting she'd been putting off for weeks while she lost herself in this beautiful, impossible situation with Jude. "What time?" she asked. 2:00. "I know it's a weird request, but would you be there? Not in the meeting, obviously, but maybe just nearby. Knowing you're there would help me stay calm." The request hit her like a physical blow. He was asking for her support during the most important moment of his professional resurrection, and she was going to have to choose between being there for him and maintaining the career that had given her the financial freedom to drive Uber as a choice rather than a necessity. "Of course," she heard herself saying, though she had no idea how she was going to make it work. That night, alone in her penthouse apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture, Diane stared at her laptop screen and tried to write. The manuscript her editor was demanding, the book that would complete her contract and secure her financial future. But every word felt hollow compared to the authentic emotions she'd been experiencing with Jude. How could she write about fictional love when she was living something so much more complex and real? Her phone buzzed with a text from Jude. "Thank you for today, for everything. I don't know what I did to deserve you in my life, but I'm grateful." Diane stared at the message until her vision blurred. He was grateful for her presence in his life, and she was living a lie that grew more complicated every day. The famous author who wrote about authentic love was living the most inauthentic relationship of her life. She tried to write, but instead found herself crafting a different kind of text message. One that would end things before they got even more complicated. One that would protect them both from the inevitable pain of her deception being discovered. "Jude, I think we need to talk." She typed and deleted the message 7 times before finally throwing her phone across the room in frustration. The next morning, Diane's phone rang at 6 a.m. Her editor, Victoria, with the subtle warmth of a tax audit. "Where exactly are you in the editing process, Diana?" "Because I'm looking at my calendar, and I see a meeting scheduled for today that you haven't confirmed." "I'm almost finished," Diane lied, staring at the blank document on her laptop screen. "Almost finished isn't finished. The marketing team has already designed the promotional campaign around your deadline. If you miss this, it pushes everything back 6 months minimum." 6 months. Half a year of her carefully planned career trajectory derailed because she'd fallen in love with a man who didn't even know her real name. "I'll be there," Diane said. 2 o'clock. And Diana, bring the completed manuscript, not notes, not an outline, the actual finished product. After Victoria hung up, Diane sat in her penthouse and tried to figure out how she could be in 2 places at once. Support Jude during his crucial presentation, and save her career during the meeting that would determine her next book contract. The answer, of course, was that she couldn't. At noon, she made the choice that she knew would haunt her. She texted Jude. "Emergency, came up with work. Can't make it to your presentation. You'll be amazing. I believe in you." Then she spent the next 2 hours frantically revising the manuscript she'd been neglecting for weeks, trying to capture on paper even a fraction of the authentic emotion she'd been living with Jude. By the time she walked into her publisher's office at exactly 2 o'clock, Diane felt like she was splitting in half. Half of her was in a conference room across town where the man she loved was trying to rebuild his life. The other half was sitting in an office chair, discussing marketing strategies and publication timelines for a book that felt increasingly meaningless. "The writing is good," Victoria said, flipping through the printed pages. "Different from your usual style, more raw, more honest." "Life experiences," Diane said vaguely. "Well, whatever inspired it, it works. We can move forward with the original timeline." Diane should have felt relief. Instead, she felt empty. She'd saved her career and abandoned the person who mattered most. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jude. "Got the job. They want to start me on Monday. Wish you could have been here, but I understand. Can't wait to tell you everything tonight." The joy in his message made her feel even worse. He'd achieved his dream of professional resurrection, and she'd missed it because she was too cowardly to tell him the truth about who she really was. That evening, when Jude climbed into her car, glowing with excitement and professional triumph, Diane felt the full weight of what her deception was costing them both. "You should have seen it, Diane. I walked in there feeling like the same old failure. But when I started talking about my plans, about what I wanted to build, it was like I remembered who I used to be, who I could be again." "I'm so proud of you," she said, and meant it completely. "I kept thinking about something D.J. Johnson wrote in her latest book, about how sometimes you have to act like the person you want to become before you feel like that person. Today, I felt like that person." Diane's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Even in his moment of triumph, he was crediting her words. Words she'd written. Words she couldn't claim credit for because of the lie she was living. "Where do you want to celebrate?" she asked. "Actually, I was thinking, would you want to come back to my place? I'll cook dinner. Nothing fancy, but I want to share this with you properly." The intimacy of the request, the assumption that she would want to share in his joy, made Diane's deception feel even more unbearable. "I'd love that," she said. Jude's apartment felt different that evening, charged with his renewed confidence in their growing connection. He moved around the kitchen with purpose, preparing a simple pasta dinner while telling her about every detail of his presentation. "They asked me about my business philosophy," he said, stirring sauce with one hand while the other gestured enthusiastically. "And I found myself talking about integrity, about building things that last, about treating every project like it matters because someone is going to live with your work every day." Diane watched him, noting the way his shoulders had straightened, the way his voice carried new authority. This was the man he'd been before life had broken him down. This was who he became when someone believed in him. "You found yourself again," she said. "No," Jude replied, turning to face her with an expression so tender it made her chest ache. "I found something better. I found who I could be when someone sees my worth." After dinner, they made love with a passion that felt different from their previous encounters, more confident, more connected, more like two people who were building something together rather than two broken people seeking comfort. Afterward, lying in Jude's bed with her head on his chest, Diane felt the full weight of what she stood to lose if he ever discovered her deception. "Diane," he said softly, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare back. "I love you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating and true. "I love you too," she whispered back, and felt her heart break a little at the honesty of it. Because she did love him, loved his gentle strength and his wounded hope and his capacity for rebuilding himself one day at a time. Loved the way he saw beauty in small things and found wisdom in words that happened to be her own. But loving him while living a lie felt like building their relationship on quicksand. Sooner or later, the foundation would give way, and everything they had created would disappear. "I want you to meet her," Jude said suddenly. "Meet who?" D.J. Johnson. "There's a book signing next month at Elliott Bay Books. I know it sounds crazy, but I want the woman I love to meet the author who saved my life. I want you to understand why her words mean so much to me." Diane's blood went cold. "Jude, I know it's silly. She probably signs books for hundreds of people and doesn't remember any of them, but her words brought me to you in a way. If I hadn't been reading her books, if I hadn't been trying to heal from what Michelle did to me, I might not have been ready to recognize what we have." The irony was so sharp it was physically painful. He wanted her to meet herself, wanted the woman he loved to understand why the author he revered meant so much to him, wanted to share the most important influences in his life with the person who'd become the most important person in his life. And she couldn't do it without destroying everything they'd built together. "What if she's not what you expect?" Diane asked carefully. "What do you mean? What if meeting her changes how you feel about her books? Sometimes the person behind the art isn't who we imagine them to be." Jude considered this seriously. "I don't think it would matter. Her words are what matter. The way they made me feel less alone, the way they helped me understand that being broken doesn't make you worthless. Meeting her would just be a way of saying thank you." Diane closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of his gratitude and her own cowardice. "Would you come with me?" he asked. "To the book signing? I don't know if that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Because I am her," she wanted to scream. "Because every word you've found healing was written by the woman currently lying in your arms. Because I've been living a lie since the moment we met, and I don't know how to tell you the truth without losing everything. I don't really do crowds, she said instead. Okay, Jude said easily, but she could hear the disappointment in his voice. I understand. But he didn't understand. How could he? He had no idea that the woman he was asking to accompany him was the same woman he was hoping to meet. No idea that his request was impossible for reasons he couldn't even imagine. As Jude drifted off to sleep beside her, Diane stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out how she'd gotten herself into such an impossible situation. Every day she didn't tell him the truth made the eventual revelation more devastating. But every day she spent with him made the thought of losing him more unbearable. She was trapped between two worlds, the public persona that had given her financial security and professional recognition, and the authentic connection that had given her emotional healing and genuine love, and sooner or later, she was going to have to choose between them. 3 weeks later, the choice was made for her. Diane was parked outside Jude's apartment, waiting for him to finish getting ready for dinner, when she noticed a familiar car pulling up behind her. Her editor's silver Mercedes, with Victoria herself climbing out of the driver's seat. Panic flooded Diane's system as she watched Victoria approach her car with the determined stride of someone who'd solved a mystery she didn't like the answer to. "Diana Johnson," Victoria said, tapping on the passenger window. "We need to talk." Diane's hands shook as she unlocked the doors, her mind racing through explanations that wouldn't sound insane. "You've been missing meetings, avoiding calls, and generally acting like someone who's forgotten she has a career," Victoria said, sliding into the passenger seat. "I decided to find out why." "How did you find you?" "Your credit card was used at a coffee shop 3 blocks from here yesterday morning. Same neighborhood where you've been spending time for weeks, according to your assistant who's been covering for your mysterious absences." Victoria's eyes were sharp with disapproval. "What I want to know is why New York Times best-selling author D.J. Johnson is driving for Uber in Seattle." Before Diane could answer, the question became moot. Jude emerged from his apartment building, looking handsome in the button-down shirt she'd helped him pick out for their dinner reservation. He walked toward her car with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in her life, someone who had every right to expect her undivided attention and honesty. He was 3 steps away when he noticed Victoria in the passenger seat, 2 steps away when his expression shifted from happiness to confusion, 1 step away when his eyes focused on the manuscript pages scattered across Victoria's lap, pages with D.J. Johnson printed clearly across the top. He stopped walking. Diane watched through the windshield as understanding dawned across his face. Watched the exact moment when the man she loved realized that the woman he'd been pouring his heart out to for months was the same woman whose books he kept like sacred texts on his nightstand. "Oh," Victoria said, following Diane's gaze. "I see." Jude's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, betrayal, and something that looked like grief. Then he turned and walked back toward his building without a word. "Jude, wait!" Diane called, fumbling with her seatbelt, but he didn't stop, didn't turn around, just disappeared through the front door of his building like he'd never existed in her life at all. "Well," Victoria said calmly, gathering her papers, "this is interesting." Diane sat in her car and felt her entire world collapse. The careful balance she'd been maintaining between her 2 lives had finally given way, and she'd lost the only thing that had ever really mattered to her. The man who'd saved her soul with his honesty was gone, and she had no one to blame but herself. The deeper they fall, the higher the stakes become. Have you ever hidden a part of yourself because you feared it would change everything? What would you do in Diane's situation? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for tomorrow's episode. Chapter 4. For 3 days, Diane existed in a state of suspended animation. She called Jude 17 times, left voicemails that ranged from desperate explanations to tearful apologies, sent text messages that went unread and unanswered. On the fourth day, she drove to his apartment building and waited. For hours. Until finally, the security guard asked her to leave. On the fifth day, she showed up at his warehouse job during lunch break, watched from across the street as he ate a sandwich alone on the loading dock, looking smaller somehow, diminished. When their eyes met across the distance, he stood up and walked inside without acknowledging her presence. It was Danny Rodriguez, the bartender who'd become Jude's closest friend since the divorce, who finally agreed to meet with her. "He's destroyed," Danny said bluntly, sliding a coffee across the table toward her. They were meeting at a diner far from Jude's neighborhood, somewhere neutral where she could try to explain the unexplainable. "Completely wrecked, won't talk about it, won't explain what happened, just says he was living in a fantasy and now he's awake." "I need to see him," Diane said. "I need to explain." "Explain what?" "That you've been lying to him for months? That the woman he trusted with his deepest pain has been writing books about it? That every intimate moment you shared was built on deception?" Each word hit her like a physical blow, but Danny wasn't finished. "Do you have any idea what those books mean to him?" "They're not just stories, lady. They're survival guides. They're the reason he didn't give up when Michelle left. They're the foundation he built his recovery on." Danny's voice was harsh with protective anger. And now he finds out the author has been there all along, listening to him pour his heart out, probably taking notes for the next bestseller. "It wasn't like that," Diane said desperately. "I never used anything he told me. I would never." "Then why didn't you tell him who you were?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and unanswerable, because the truth was too complicated, too selfish, too revealing of her own cowardice. "Because I was scared," she admitted finally. "Scared that if he knew who I really was, he'd stop seeing me as just Diane. Scared that he'd want the famous author instead of the real woman. Scared that our connection would change if he knew I was the person he'd been putting on a pedestal." Danny studied her for a long moment. "And now?" "Now I've lost him either way." "Yeah," Danny agreed. "You have." The book signing at Elliott Bay Books was scheduled for a Thursday evening in December. Diane considered canceling, but her publicist reminded her that 300 people had already bought tickets, and the bookstore had ordered extra inventory specifically for the event. So she went through the motions, put on the professional author costume, flowing dress, carefully styled hair, makeup that made her look approachable but polished. The version of herself that existed for public consumption, the one who had wise answers about love and healing, and the courage to rebuild your life. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to give advice about authentic relationships while her own had crumbled under the weight of her deception. The bookstore was packed. 300 people who'd found meaning in her words, who'd come hoping for insight into the creative process, maybe some wisdom about love and resilience. She spotted familiar faces from previous events, devoted readers who followed her tour schedule, and in the back row, partially hidden behind a pillar, she saw Jude. Her heart stopped completely. He was there, despite everything. Despite the betrayal and the lies and the complete destruction of trust between them. He'd come to hear her speak about the books that had saved his life, written by the woman who'd destroyed it. Diane made it through the reading somehow, though her voice shook when she reached the passage about forgiveness. Made it through the question and answer session, though every response felt hollow compared to the authentic conversations she'd shared with Jude in the intimate darkness of her car. "How do you write such realistic relationship dynamics?" asked a woman in the third row. "Because I live them," Diane wanted to say. "Because I fall in love with broken men and then break them further with my cowardice." "Research," she said instead, "and listening to people's stories." When the formal portion ended and the book signing began, Diane found herself watching the back of the room, watching for Jude to either leave or join the line of people waiting for signatures. He did neither, just stood there, arms crossed, watching her interact with readers who thanked her for saving their marriages, their sanity, their hope. The line dwindled. 10 people, 5, 3, 2, 1, and then it was just Diane and the bookstore staff cleaning up, and Jude still standing in the back like a ghost haunting the scene of his own betrayal. "We're closing up," the events coordinator said gently. "Is there anything else you need?" "Just a few more minutes," Diane said. After the staff retreated to give them privacy, Jude finally approached. He moved with the careful control of someone who was barely holding himself together, and when he stopped 3 feet away from her signing table, the distance felt like an ocean. "I came to hear you read," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The passage about betrayal from your second book." Diane's throat tightened. "Jude." "You didn't read it?" "I couldn't." "Why not?" "Too close to home." The words were quiet, but they cut like razor blades. Diane looked at him, really looked, and saw the damage she'd done. The trust in his eyes had been replaced by careful guardedness. The open affection had been walled off behind protective distance. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing the words were completely inadequate. "For which part?" "For lying about who you were, for letting me pour my heart out while you sat there, knowing you were the author I was talking about, for making love to me while living a lie." Each question hit like a physical blow. For all of it. For everything. "Were you ever going to tell me?" The question she'd been dreading, because the honest answer revealed the full extent of her cowardice. "I don't know," she whispered. Jude nodded as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "Do you have any idea what this feels like? Finding out that the woman I love and the author who saved my life are the same person, and I never knew? That every conversation we had, every intimate moment we shared, was built on a lie." "Not a lie," Diane said desperately. "Everything between us was real. My feelings for you, the connection we had, the way you made me feel like I could be myself." "Which self?" Jude asked. "DJ Johnson, the famous author, or Diane, the Uber driver? Because apparently they're the same person, and I've been in love with someone who doesn't actually exist." "She does exist. I exist. The real me. The woman who fell in love with you. The woman who fell in love with me was lying about the most fundamental part of her identity." Diane felt tears burning her eyes. "I was scared. Scared that if you knew who I really was, you'd stop seeing me as just Diane. Scared that you'd want the author instead of the woman. So you decided for both of us. You decided that I couldn't handle the truth, that I wasn't trustworthy enough to know who I was really talking to." His voice broke slightly. "Do you understand how that feels? To realize that someone you trusted completely didn't trust you at all." The accusation hit her like a physical blow because it was completely accurate. She hadn't trusted him with her truth, had made assumptions about how he'd react, rather than giving him the chance to prove her wrong. "You're right," she said simply. "I was wrong. About everything." Jude was quiet for a long moment, and in the silence, Diane allowed herself to hope that maybe, somehow, they could find a way back to each other. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a familiar book. Her latest novel, the one she'd written while falling in love with him. The pages were worn from multiple readings, margins filled with his careful handwriting. "I've been rereading this," he said, setting it on the table between them, "looking for clues I missed, trying to figure out how much of what I told you ended up in your work." "Nothing," Diane said fiercely. "I would never use your stories without permission. I would never exploit what you shared with me." "Wouldn't you?" Chapter 7, where the male character talks about feeling like a failure after his business collapsed. Chapter 12, where he describes the exact way his ex-wife made him feel worthless. Chapter 15, where he finds healing through someone else's words. Diane's blood went cold as she realized what he was saying. Jude, no, those scenes existed before I met you. That book was already outlined when you started driving me around and listening to me confirm every single detail you'd already written. The accusation hung in the air between them, ugly and devastating. And worst of all, Diane could see how it looked from his perspective, how their entire relationship could seem like research for her next novel, how every intimate conversation could feel like material being gathered for public consumption. "That's not what happened," she said desperately. "Yes, the themes were similar, but that's because everyone who's been through heartbreak recognizes the same patterns. Your story resonated with me because I'd lived something like it, not because I was mining it for content. How would I know the difference? How would I know what's real and what's just good research?" The question revealed the heart of what her deception had destroyed. Not just his trust in her identity, but his trust in the authenticity of everything they'd shared. "Because you know me," Diane said, reaching toward him before stopping herself. "You know who I am when I'm with you. You know how I feel about you." "I thought I did. But it turns out I don't know anything about you at all." Jude picked up the book and held it like evidence of her crimes. "I need you to understand something, Diane. These books aren't just entertainment for me. They're not casual reading. They're the reason I'm still alive. When Michelle left, when the business failed, when I was sitting in my empty apartment wondering if anything would ever feel worth fighting for again, these words saved me." His voice cracked, and Diane saw tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "And now I find out that the woman who wrote them was sitting 3 feet away from me, listening to me talk about how much they meant to me, and she never said a word. How is that not the deepest betrayal you can imagine?" Diane felt her own tears falling now, unstoppable and futile. "Because I loved you. Because what we had felt too precious to risk destroying with complications. What we had was already destroyed the moment you decided to lie to me. You just didn't tell me about it." The finality in his voice made something break inside her chest. This wasn't a fight they were having, with the possibility of resolution and forgiveness. This was an ending. "Jude, please, can't we try to work through this? Can't we find a way to rebuild the trust?" "With what foundation? Everything I thought I knew about you was wrong. Everything I told you was said to someone I thought was a stranger who happened to be a good listener. If I'd known you were DJ Johnson, I never would have shared those things, never would have made myself that vulnerable." "Why not?" "Because you're not just anyone, Diane. You're someone whose opinion matters to millions of people. You have influence, platform, power, and I'm nobody." "You're not nobody," Diane said fiercely. "You're everything. You're the man who taught me what authentic resilience looks like. You're the person who showed me that real strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up, even when you don't think you can." "Pretty words," Jude said quietly. "You're good at those." The dismissal in his voice was like a door slamming shut between them. "I should go," he said, turning toward the exit. "Jude, wait." He stopped but didn't turn around. "I love you," Diane said desperately. "That was never a lie. That was the most honest thing I've ever felt." "I love you too," he replied, and her heart leapt with hope until he continued. "That's what makes this so devastating. I'm in love with someone who doesn't exist." After he left, Diane sat alone in the empty bookstore surrounded by stacks of her own books, and understood for the first time what it meant to be completely and utterly heartbroken. Not the dramatic, temporary heartbreak she had written about in her novels, but the quiet, permanent kind that changes the fundamental structure of who you are. She'd gained the whole world of literary success and lost the only thing that had ever really mattered to her. Chapter 5. A month passed. Diane went through the motions of her professional life. Interviews, promotional events, meetings with her editor about the next book contract. But everything felt hollow, mechanical, like she was performing the role of a successful author rather than actually being one. She stopped driving for Uber. Couldn't bear the thought of picking up strangers, listening to their stories, knowing that she'd lost the one passenger whose story had actually mattered. She tried to write, but the words felt artificial after months of authentic connection. How could she craft fictional love stories when she'd destroyed the most real love she'd ever experienced? Her penthouse apartment, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every comfort bought with money earned from books that had been inspired by conversations with Jude. Every piece of furniture chosen by D.J. Johnson, the public persona, rather than Diane, the woman who'd fallen in love with a broken contractor and learned what authentic connection felt like. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent her career writing about love and healing, and now she was more broken than she'd ever been. It was Danny who called her on a Tuesday evening in January, 3 months after the book signing that had ended everything. "He's in the hospital," Danny said without preamble. Diane's blood went cold. What happened? Construction accident, beam fell, caught him across the chest. He's going to be fine, but he's banged up pretty badly. Broken ribs, concussion, the works. Which hospital? Before you go rushing over there, you should know he doesn't want to see you. The words hit her like a physical blow, but she'd expected them. How do you know? Because I asked him. When they were loading him into the ambulance, he was conscious enough to grab my shirt and make me promise I wouldn't call you. Said he didn't want your pity or your guilt. Diane closed her eyes, feeling the full weight of what she'd lost. Even injured and vulnerable, Jude was protecting himself from her presence in his life. But I'm calling you anyway, Danny continued, because someone should know. Someone who cares about him should know that he almost... Danny's voice broke, and Diane realized the bartender was crying. He almost what? Died, Diane. For about 30 seconds when they first pulled him out, we thought we'd lost him. And do you know what he said when he came to? He asked for a D.J. Johnson book, said if he was going to die, he wanted to hear her words one more time. The information hit Diane like a sledgehammer to the chest. Even after everything that had happened between them, even after the betrayal and the lies and the complete destruction of trust, Jude still found comfort in her words, still turned to D.J. Johnson for healing, even while rejecting Diane completely. Which hospital? She asked again. Harborview. Room 314. But Diane, no. He doesn't want to see me. That's not what I was going to say. Danny's voice was gentler now. I was going to say that he loves you. Still, even though he won't admit it, even though he's angry and hurt and convinced you betrayed him, he loves you enough that it's destroying him to stay away from you. After Danny hung up, Diane sat in her apartment and stared at the city lights beyond her floor-to-ceiling windows. Somewhere out there, in a hospital room 12 miles away, the man she loved was lying broken and alone, asking for comfort from words she'd written while falling in love with him. The same words he now believed were contaminated by her deception. She couldn't go to him, couldn't violate his clearly stated boundary about not wanting to see her. But she could do something else. Diane opened her laptop and began to write. Not a novel this time, not fiction designed for publication and public consumption. Just a letter. The most honest thing she'd ever written. Dear Jude, she began, and then poured her heart onto the page. Everything she'd wanted to say at the bookstore but hadn't found the words for. Everything she'd felt during their months together. Everything she had lost when her deception was discovered. She wrote about the night she'd first picked him up, how his pain had resonated with her own healing journey. She wrote about falling in love with his gentle strength, his capacity for hope despite devastating disappointment, his ability to find beauty in small moments. She wrote about the terror that had kept her from revealing her identity, the fear that had seemed so rational at the time but now felt like the greatest mistake of her life. And she wrote about the books, about how every word she'd ever written about healing and resilience had been theoretical until she met him, about how his courage in rebuilding himself had taught her what real strength looked like, about how loving him had made her a better writer, not because she'd used his story, but because he'd taught her what authentic emotion felt like. When she finished, the letter was 12 pages long, and her laptop was wet with tears. She printed it, sealed it in an envelope, and drove to Harborview Medical Center at 2 a.m. The night nurse at the reception desk looked skeptical when Diane explained that she needed to deliver something to a patient. Visiting hours ended at 8, the nurse said. You'll have to come back tomorrow. Please, Diane said. I can't see him. He doesn't want visitors, but I need him to have this. It's important. Something in her voice must have conveyed the desperation she felt, because the nurse's expression softened. Room number? 314, Jude Carpenter. I'll make sure he gets it, the nurse promised. Diane drove home through empty streets, knowing she'd done the only thing she could do, put her truth on paper and trusted that somehow it might matter. 3 days later, her phone rang at midnight. Unknown number that her heart recognized before her mind did. I got your letter, Jude said without preamble. Diane's heart hammered against her ribs. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a falling beam. But that's not why I'm calling. Silence stretched between them, filled with 3 months of unspoken words and unresolved hurt. I read it 17 times, Jude said finally. Your letter. The nurses probably think I'm obsessed with that envelope. And I don't know what to do with it, with what you wrote, with how it made me feel. Diane closed her eyes, afraid to hope. How did it make you feel? Like maybe I was wrong about some things, like maybe the story is more complicated than I thought it was. Jude. But I'm still angry, he said quickly. I'm still hurt. I still don't understand how someone could live a lie for that long, no matter what their reasons were. I know. Do you? Do you really understand what it felt like to discover that nothing I thought I knew about you was true? Yes, Diane said simply. Because that's exactly how I felt about myself. Like I'd been living a lie for so long that I'd forgotten who I really was underneath it all. The admission surprised them both. Diane hadn't planned to say it, hadn't even fully realized it was true until the words left her mouth. What do you mean? I mean that being DJ Johnson became so consuming that I lost track of who Diane actually was. The fame, the expectations, the public persona, it all felt more real than my actual life. Until I met you. And then I remembered what it felt like to be seen for who I really am instead of what I've accomplished. To be valued for my thoughts and feelings instead of my bestseller status. Her voice cracked. You made me feel human again, Jude. That's why I was so terrified to tell you the truth. Because being with you was the first time in years that I felt like myself. Jude was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. In your letter, you said that meeting me changed your writing. It did. How? Diane hesitated, then decided that radical honesty was the only thing that might save them. Because before I met you, I was writing about healing and resilience from memory, from my own experience years ago. But watching you rebuild yourself, seeing your courage in the face of genuine devastation, it reminded me what those words actually mean, what they cost. You're saying I inspired your work. I'm saying you inspired me to remember why I started writing in the first place, to help people feel less alone in their pain. Another long silence. The accident, Jude said finally. When I was lying there under that beam, when I thought I might be dying. Do you know what I regretted most? What? That I'd never get to tell you that I forgive you. Diane's breath caught. You forgive me? I'm trying to. I want to, but I don't know how to trust you again. I don't know how to believe that anything between us was real when it was all built on a lie. Because it wasn't all built on a lie, Diane said desperately. The connection we had, the conversations, the way we made each other feel, that was all real. The only lie was my name. Your name, your job, your entire life story. My feelings, Diane interrupted. Were my feelings a lie? When I told you I loved you, was that fiction? No, Jude admitted quietly. I don't think your feelings were a lie. Then maybe that's where we start. With what was real instead of what wasn't. Jude was quiet for so long that Diane wondered if he'd hung up. Finally he spoke. I'm being discharged tomorrow afternoon. Danny's picking me up at 2. Okay. There's a coffee shop on Pine Street, Grind Coffee. Do you know it? Yes. Meet me there at 4. If you want to try to figure this out, if you want to see whether there's anything left to salvage, meet me there. Jude, yes, of course. I'll be there. And Diane? Yeah? Bring a copy of your first book, the one about starting over after everything falls apart. I want you to read me the passage that saved my life. I want to hear those words in your voice, knowing they came from your heart. After he hung up, Diane sat in her penthouse and felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the guarantee of forgiveness or the promise of reconciliation, but the possibility that maybe, somehow, they could find their way back to each other. Maybe love really could survive the worst kind of betrayal if both people were brave enough to rebuild it from the ground up. Chapter 6. The next afternoon, Diane arrived at Grind Coffee 30 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner where they could talk without being overheard. She'd brought her first novel, the one Jude had mentioned, along with a heart full of desperate hope and a mind full of careful words she'd rehearsed, but would probably forget the moment she saw him. When he walked through the door at exactly 4 o'clock, her breath caught. He moved carefully, obviously still recovering from his injuries, but there was something different in his posture. Less defeated, more like the man he'd been becoming before their world had collapsed. He spotted her immediately and made his way to her table with the deliberate movements of someone who'd made a decision and was following through despite his reservations. Hi, he said, settling into the chair across from her with a slight wince. Hi. Diane searched his face for clues about what he was thinking, what he was feeling, whether there was any chance that they could find their way back to each other. You brought the book, he observed, nodding toward the paperback on the table between them. You asked me to. I did. Jude looked at the cover for a moment, then back at her. Before we do this, I need to know something. Anything. In all the time we spent together, all the conversations we had, all the nights, I poured my heart out to you in that car. Was any of it genuine? Or was I just an interesting research subject? The question she'd been dreading, the one that cut to the heart of everything they'd lost. It was genuine, Diane said without hesitation. Every moment of it, every conversation, every connection, every feeling. It was all real. How can you be sure? How can you separate what you felt as Diane from what you observed as D.J. Johnson? Because D.J. Johnson never felt anything like what I felt with you. D.J. Johnson writes about love from a distance, from memory, from imagination. But Diane fell in love with you so completely that she forgot to be scared of what that meant. Jude studied her face as if looking for evidence of deception. When did you know? That you loved me? The night at the diner. When you talked about feeling invisible, about wondering if anyone would ever really see you again. I looked across that table and realized that you'd been seeing me more clearly than I'd been seeing myself. And you didn't think that was important enough to warrant honesty? I thought it was too important to risk losing. Jude leaned back in his chair, wincing slightly at the movement. Do you understand how backwards that is? You were so afraid of losing something real that you built it on something fake. Yes, Diane said simply. I understand that now. I understand that I was a coward, and that my cowardice hurt you in ways I never intended. I understand that trust, once broken, might never fully heal. But I also understand that what we had was worth fighting for, worth the risk of being completely honest, even when honesty might destroy everything. Jude picked up the book, turning it over in his hands like a talisman. This passage you're going to read to me. Chapter 18, the one about rebuilding from ashes. I've read it probably 100 times. It's the reason I didn't give up after Michelle left. I remember writing it. Tell me about that. About what you were feeling when those words came out of you. Diane closed her eyes, traveling back to that night 3 years ago when she'd been broken in ways that felt irreparable. I was sitting in my apartment at 2 a.m, crying over a relationship that had ended badly. Marcus, the man I thought I was going to marry, had left me for someone younger and more successful. My first book contract had just fallen through. I felt like everything I'd worked for, everything I'd believed about myself, was gone. She opened her eyes and found Jude watching her intently. I was writing in my journal, trying to make sense of the pain, when I realized something. The worst thing that had ever happened to me was also teaching me something I'd never learned before, that you can lose everything external and still have something left inside that can't be taken away. Your worth, Jude said quietly, my worth, my capacity for resilience, my ability to begin again, even when beginning again felt impossible. Jude opened the book to a page marked with multiple bookmarks and pushed it across the table toward her. Read it to me, in your voice, the voice that wrote it. Diane picked up the book and found the passage he'd marked, words she'd written in her darkest hour, never knowing they would someday comfort the man she'd fall in love with. The hardest part about losing everything, she read, isn't the practical matter of rebuilding your life. It's the spiritual matter of rebuilding your faith in yourself. When everything external falls away, the relationship, the job, the future you'd planned, what remains is the question of whether you believe you're worth the effort it takes to start over. Her voice caught slightly, remembering the pain that had birthed those words. The answer always is yes, not because starting over is easy, not because the pain will magically disappear, not because you'll never face loss again, but because your worth isn't determined by your circumstances. Your value isn't measured by your achievements. Your humanity isn't diminished by your failures. She looked up to find Jude's eyes bright with tears. You are worth the effort it takes to rebuild. You are worth the courage it requires to hope again. You are worth the love that feels impossible to believe in when you're sitting in the ashes of what used to be your life. Those words, Jude said softly, saved my life. They saved mine too. Writing them forced me to believe them again. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared experience settling between them like a bridge across the chasm their deception had created. I want to try, Jude said finally. Try what? To rebuild this. To see if we can create something real and honest from what's left of what we had. Diane's heart leapt with hope, so sharp it was almost painful. Are you sure? No, I'm not sure about anything. I don't know if I can trust you again. I don't know if we can get past what happened. I don't know if love is enough to overcome deception this fundamental. But I know that losing you has been worse than being lied to by you. I know that being angry at you still feels better than not having you in my life at all. And I know that the woman who wrote those words, who poured her own pain into healing others, is someone worth fighting for. Diane felt tears sliding down her cheeks. What would that look like? Rebuilding. Honestly. Complete radical honesty about everything. No more secrets, no more protection, no more being afraid of how the truth might change things. I can do that. Can you? Can you really? Because it means being Diane and DJ Johnson at the same time. It means integrating all the parts of yourself instead of compartmentalizing them. It means trusting me with the whole truth, even when it's complicated or messy or unflattering. Diane considered this seriously. The prospect of being completely known, completely seen, was both terrifying and liberating. Yes, she said finally, I can do that. I want to do that. Jude nodded slowly. Then we start there. With truth. Where do we start? With this. Jude reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The contact was tentative, careful, but real. With admitting that we both made mistakes. You lied to me, but I also put you on a pedestal that made honesty feel impossible. You were afraid to trust me with your truth, but I was also afraid to believe that someone like you could love someone like me. Someone like me. Successful, talented, important. He smiled sadly. I spent so much time feeling grateful that DJ Johnson's words had saved my life that I never considered I might have something to offer her in return. You offered me everything, Diane said fiercely. You offered me authenticity and genuine connection and the reminder that success means nothing if you don't have someone real to share it with. And you offered me hope when I'd forgotten what it felt like. They sat holding hands across the coffee shop table, two broken people who'd found healing in each other's wounds, trying to figure out whether love really could overcome the worst kind of betrayal. This won't be easy, Jude said. No. I might have trust issues for a while. I might need reassurance about things that seem obvious to you. I might have honesty issues for a while. I might need reminders that the truth is safer than protection. Are we really doing this? Are we really going to try to rebuild something that might be permanently broken? Diane looked at him across the table. This beautiful, wounded man who'd unknowingly taught her how to write about courage by showing her what it looked like in real life. Yes, she said, we're really doing this. Because sometimes love meant starting over from the ruins of what you'd built before. Sometimes healing meant admitting that you'd been the cause of your own deepest wound. Sometimes hope meant believing that two people who'd saved each other's lives could learn to save each other's hearts as well. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the person whose words had been your salvation turned out to be the same person whose love could be your resurrection. 6 months later, Diane stood in the wings of a bookstore in Portland, waiting to take the stage for another reading. But this time, everything was different. This time, Jude was in the front row, not hiding in the back. This time, her bio included the line, "She lives in Seattle with her partner, who reminds her daily that the best stories are the ones we live, rather than the ones we write." This time, when someone asked her about writing authentic relationships, she could answer honestly. "I learned about authentic love," she said, looking directly at Jude, "from a man who taught me the difference between being known for what you've accomplished and being loved for who you are. He showed me that real intimacy isn't about sharing your successes. It's about sharing your struggles and having someone choose to stay anyway." After the event, as they walked hand in hand to their car, Jude squeezed her fingers gently. "How did it feel?" he asked, "being completely honest up there?" "Terrifying," Diane admitted, "and liberating." "And right. Good. Because I have a confession to make." Diane's heart skipped, old fears rising to the surface. "What?" "I've been taking notes," Jude said with a grin that was pure mischief. "During our conversations, detailed notes about what it's like to be in love with a famous author who used to be scared of her own authenticity." Jude Carpenter, are you writing a book about me? Maybe. Would that bother you? Diane considered this seriously. 6 months ago, the thought of someone else controlling her narrative would have terrified her. Now, the idea of being seen so completely that someone wanted to write about her felt like the deepest form of love imaginable. Only if you don't let me read it first, she said. Deal. But I get to quote you extensively. Fair enough, as long as you use my real name. Both of them? Both of them. Diane Johnson, also known as DJ Johnson, also known as the woman who almost lost the love of her life because she was too scared to be completely known. And also known as the woman brave enough to fight for love, even when it seemed impossible. They drove home through the Seattle evening, two people who'd learned that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones where you have to save each other twice, once from your circumstances and once from yourselves. In the end, Diane thought, the best stories really were the ones you lived rather than the ones you wrote. But if you were very lucky, sometimes they were the same thing. Sometimes the woman whose words saved your soul turned out to be the woman whose love saved your life. And sometimes, if you were brave enough to be completely honest about who you really were, that woman would turn out to be exactly who you'd been looking for all along. Have you ever discovered that a stranger was actually the exact person you needed to meet? Or maybe you've been someone's unexpected angel without realizing it. Share your stories of meant-to-be connections in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for tomorrow's episode. And remember, sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the simplest act of truly seeing someone. Thank you for letting me share Diane and Jude's journey with you.